We have our very own Steve Blank and Joe Felter joining us today to discuss the origins of Hacking for Defense, a course that many of you have taken or have expressed interest in taking. How many of you have taken Hacking for Defense? Ooh. Wow, okay. This will be interesting. Actually, in fact, I remember it wasn't too long ago that you guys were getting the course off the ground since I was on campus back in 2016. And also I was working on getting this speaker series, Silicon Valley and the U.S. government, off the ground. And just we talked about having the speaker series also be an introduction to students who want to take a 3 to 4 unit course like Hacking for Defense. So it's been incredible to see how these efforts have evolved since then. Steve, why don't we start with, can you just describe to us what is Hacking for Defense?
It's magic. So Hacking for Defense is a way for Stanford students and now students in 60 some odd universities, a couple of countries, to actually get their hands on real DoD and potentially IC problems and actually work on them with teams of 3 to 5 students and deeply understand the problem by getting out of the building, building what we call minimum viable products for potential solutions, putting them in front of stakeholders and warfighters, et cetera, using a methodology called the lean method that we've teach elsewhere at Stanford. And we'll talk more about it, but it's basically a experiential hands-on class for real world problems in national security. Joe, anything you would add to that?
Right on. I'll go on the next one.
So maybe we could talk about origins for Hacking for Defense. How did it get started? Why did you want to put it together?
I'm interested in hearing Joe's version of the story.
Well, you were there, and actually you were nearby as well, Ernestine. But this is back in 2015, actually. How to go forward, actually how it got started, I think a group of people who were patriots and cared about national security, cared about finding opportunities to get our best and brightest involved in really important national security challenges. I had been in the military for 20 plus years in Special Forces. I'll try to do the quick one because I know this class is only so long, but I had started a company called BMNT when I got out of the military and brought in a Colonel Pete Newell, who was legendary in the military, brigade commander in Iraq, Silver Star winner, and ran what's called the Army's Rapid Equipment Force. But we had started something called Hack Defense, which was really going to be just kind of more traditional hackathon, where we'd bring students and people in to work on a defense sponsored challenge like for a day. But then, whom you know, remember John Kuhn, a former one of our special operators that I was connected to while I was still in the military before he came to Stanford. Yeah, so he came to Stanford, was taking Steve's famous Lean Launchpad class and was really inspired, like as people are that take Steve's class. But I stayed in touch with him, and he told me about Steve Blank and how amazing he was actually working on what was kind of a de facto Hacking for Defense problem in the Lean Launchpad program. But he was interested in introducing me to Steve and Pete Newell, whom we all knew, and we went down to BMNT and we started talking. Steve Blank talked about his approach, and then Pete Newell shared some of his experiences in the Rapid Equipment Force from the Army in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I had spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan too. But long story short, it was kind of inspirational to wow, let's riff on Steve's very successful Lean Launchpad class and let's get students the chance to get involved in solving national security challenges. And we set off, this is in 2015, to rewrite Steve's educator's guide and tailor it to a Hacking for Defense model where the big differences was students are going to be working on defense and intelligence community challenges. So we piloted the class. I know you give me, I got more questions, look, but piloted the first class and we thought, who's going to take this class? This is Stanford. This is the nickname Get Rich U. We know why they take Steve's Lean Launchpad class, because they literally get rich doing it.
Rich, yeah.
And many of them have. But who would take our class? Well, turns out we had 3x the applicants as we had space, that students at a minimum wanted to work on tough challenges, all the engineers here. But we tapped into what we think is a strain of patriotism, a sense of wanting to serve, whether they may not want to join the military or a 3-letter agency or the government, but they want to lend their incredible Stanford intellect to work on problems that really matter and have impact. And we tapped into that. Very successful first year, and then as working with Steve, it's nothing you always have to scale. So we started to scale it, got some resources from the Office of Naval Research, and pushed it out to more universities. Now it's in multiple countries, and I think we have why do you want to do this in Sweden? Why would you want to do this?
Why I want to do it? Of course, because we need to use the brilliant minds of students to solve real problem.
All right. Plus, we're trying to evangelize it. So it's been a great ride and it's still going. But I'll rip some more.
Everything Steve touches has to go national or international.
It was very interesting. And, the fact was, well, why don't we create a class? It's kind of like a Stanford thing. Well, sure. Why don't we just have a whiteboard? It'll look like this, and we'll take this piece. But they had this great class called Hack for Defense. And, like a great entrepreneur, great artists steal. I said, why don't you just add the word hacking? And of course, everybody hated the name Hacking for Defense. No, we're not hacking. We're not breaking. I said, but no one will forget the name. And of course, no one has forgotten the name. And I should tell them the story about the department at MS&E said, there is no way we're putting the title of a class called Hacking for Anything on our formal whatever. And then we got Bill Perry to say, well, what a great name that is. Yes. And of course, Bill Perry was a ex-Secretary of Defense who was in the MS&E department. And when he waved his magic wand across our class, which you got him to do, Joe, it became magic. So back to you.
Yeah, that's great. So Steve, maybe dive into what exactly is the Lean Startup, Lean Launchpad methodology, and why does this work for addressing national security needs?
So this was the inference I was talking about, what Pete discovered on the battlefield for rapid equipping, and I discovered just doing 8 startups in Silicon Valley, is that on day one, the problem, if you're smart, and by definition you all are, the smarter you are, the harder it is not to believe your own BS, meaning you think you not only understand the problem, you typically implicitly think you understand the problem, and you dive right into building the solution. And then you think, all I need to do is get the right team, raise some money, here are the PowerPoint slides, build the solution, and the biggest problem I'm going to have is the room big enough to hold the bags of money that are going to come. And the answer is very rarely. And where you go all the way wrong is on day one, you had a series of assumptions, guesses. And at Stanford, because we pay a lot of money, I'll allow you to use the word hypotheses. As we have a series of untested hypotheses about, in the commercial world, customers and the distribution channel and pricing, et cetera. In the DoD, we have a set of assumptions about, stakeholders and warfighters and colors of money and how do we get to deployment at scale, et cetera. All those are hypotheses on day one. And unless you've truly done this multiple times, you're just kind of guessing. And so the whole lean method, back to answering your question, is how do we rapidly turn those hypotheses into facts? That is, on day one, any new venture is a faith-based enterprise. It's a religious activity. It's a big idea. All you have is religion. But you literally need that to start, but you rapidly want to translate that into evidence-based, fact-based decisions. And so how you do that is you get out of the building, step one, using a process called customer development. You build what we call minimum viable products. That is, not just prototypes of the product, but they could be of pricing, of outcomes, of screenshots, of wireframes, of something. And they're called MVPs, minimum viable products. And a radical notion, which never even existed in the 20th century, is you're allowed to pivot. And a pivot is a fancy word for you're allowed to change your mind without getting fired, which, believe it or not, did not exist in the 20th century. And in the DoD, the equivalent is, no, you don't start with requirements, you start with problems. Because if you know all you have are assumptions, they're going to change. A pivot says, when I have enough evidence that my initial assumption is wrong, I'm allowed to say we have enough evidence to change either the features of the product or how we're funding it or pricing or who the stakeholders are or who the saboteurs are, et cetera. And so those are the kind of components of lean. Customer development, get out of the building, test assumptions, build the product iteratively and incrementally with MVPs, literally weekly in a class or as fast as you can in the real world. And then we use something called the business model or mission model canvas to keep track of all the components we're trying to test. Who are the stakeholders? So, what's mission achievement or what's revenue in the commercial world, et cetera. It's not a very complicated set of things. It's just a framework. And by the way, it's not the framework. It's a framework. And if you got a better one, feel free to use it. No one is going to tell you you have to, except if you take the class. But the rest is just kind of a way to kind of cut down all this cruft that went on in the 20th century of kind of like flailing and going out of business because you made some dumb assumptions, mostly because you believed that what was in your head was correct. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So what are some
You took the class, right?
Actually, I haven't taken the class.
You haven't taken the class? Oh, wait a minute.
Missed the opportunity.
Oh, wait a minute. Now you're going to wait a minute. You're going to co-teach the class with us.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. I think you have lots of qualified instructors.
No, wait a minute. Don't you think you ought to be recruiting her?
But so what are some of the problem statements that you've sourced from DoD, IC, and what are some?
Let me just riff on one thing from Steve, because he mentioned the business model canvas and the mission model canvas. Two big shifts, and there may be some other minor ones, but in the business world, I'm speaking in front of the guy who developed it, but success is measured in profit in the business world, right? But in the types of problems we're addressing, it's measured in mission achievement, and impact. So we had to kind of tweak the business model canvas to the mission model canvas. And one thing that's important, those of you in the military and government know this, in the military and government agencies, the person using the product isn't the person buying the product. In the military, you've got this acquisitions and requirement system where someone else, you're on a path in Afghanistan with a mine detector that is saving or losing your life, and someone else decided which is a good one and bought it for you. You had no impact on it. So those are two big distinctions. But yeah, problem statements, there's a range. We went from DoD across the services to across the with Steve here and others, we were supporting the intelligence community a lot. I mean, it's just and now with 60+ universities doing it, it's a whole range.
What are some of the problems? Some of the solutions?
Can I tell the business model and mission model canvas story? It's so any of you have seen the Osterwalder's business model canvas? You've seen it. All of you should probably look at it online. It's basically the framework we use. It's a single piece of paper that anybody ever hear of writing a business plan, right? It's basically how to write a business plan in a single piece of paper. That's what I love about it. It tells you all the important things you ought to be thinking about before you write the plan, right? Who are the customers? What's the channel? Whatever. And the famous book that Osterwalder wrote was something called Business Model Generation. And why I love it, it's all pictures. So I could understand, right? It's like nice pictures to describe one picture, right? It truly is worth looking at. Well, I'm telling you the story because that was kind of one of the three components of the commercial class called Lean Startup. And so we used this actually before the class, I used it inside the intelligence community. And of course, at the end of the first class, the guy who ended up teaching it and scaling it with me inside this agency, Matt, calls up and said, Steve, one of the boxes in the business model canvas says revenue and profit. And he said, well, if we have that, we're all going to jail. This is kind of a great diagram, but doesn't quite match, as Joe said, what actually happens in the DoD and IC. Some of these things it says customers, and yeah, they're kind of customers, but they're also stakeholders and warfighters and saboteurs and contractors. And so is there any way we can modify it? And I go, well, I didn't write it. It's my friend, Alexander Osterwalder. And I thought, we're entrepreneurs. So me and Matt from this agency and Pete Newell get on the phone to Osterwalder, and within an hour and a half, we created an entirely new canvas called the Mission Model Canvas, which had, from about 20 feet, looks identical to Business Model Canvas, but is oriented for DoD, IC, and nonprofits. And you look at it and you go, why, of course, it was designed for us. But literally, it's how we move. Right? Didn't work? Okay, pivot it. Oh, we didn't create it? Let's call the guy who did create it and work with him, and boom, 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 and that's how we got them.
One of those calls was on Super Bowl Sunday, about halftime, and Pete and I were at my house.
Sorry, you were there too.
We may have had a couple beverages at that point, but we were being very creative, and it turned out well. So I'll just leave it at that.
Alex was in Switzerland.
Yeah,
it was in the middle of the night. I called him up and said,
and Steve is at his palatial ranch, which some of you've been to. So.
Right.
Are there other tools and frameworks that are key to the course that students take, or like other kind of things that are different from Lean Launchpad?
What's different about this class at Stanford and Lean Launchpad is not much. But behind this class nationally is a whole set of machinery that you don't see unless you're trying to start a national program. And that is how the problems are sourced. Between Joe and Jeff Decker and Pete Newell and I, we kind of have enough contacts in DoD-IC that I guess we could get our own problem sets from multiple people. But Pete and Joe and BMMT stood up a nonprofit called the Common Mission Project that actually sources problems from across the DoD and IC and doles them out to these 60 universities. That's a massive effort that you don't see. It's kind of like all the background on a play. All you see are the actors in the front, and it looks easy, but there's people doing lighting and stage direction, and there's musicians and whatever. Those are all the moving parts.
Yeah. How do you pick the problems?
How do we pick the problems?
You get like lots and lots of problem statements from DoD, IC. How do you pick them?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, the students pick them.
But you mean, how are they selected?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. They have to be scoped to lend themselves to classroom work. They need to have impact. And they need to be problems, not solutions. And that's a big thing. A lot of sponsors, if you will, and we can talk about that later, will come with almost like a solution, and they just want to have someone go down the road to get a better, refine that solution. But they have to be problems. They have to be very kind of open-ended like that, to lend themselves to let Steve's methodology go to work in the discovery process. But we want to be scoped, relevant, important, impactful, and get students inspired. They're going to work many, many, many hours throughout the quarter, and some of them well beyond that. It has to inspire students. They got to be problems that matter.
Yeah. So what are some of the problems?
Well, they also have to be unclassified,
Yeah,
and then we'll tell you, and they have to be scrubbed down. And sometimes, actually, last year we got one from In-Q-Tel that was so scrubbed down, it was unintelligible. It was like they had a data fusion problem that they actually translated into an F1 racing team, and it was like the students, nor I, could figure out what the heck. So we finally got them to write it in English that was still unclassified. But in the first class, the one we still talk about was a team I didn't even want to let in.
You didn't let them in the class.
Yeah, because it wasn't a problem we got. It was one they wanted to work on, which we'll now do every once in a while. If you have your own, you think there's a problem to solve. It was a bunch of engineers here. So what did they know? They wanted the NRO had these $billion Battlestar Galacticas for synthetic aperture radar satellites that I had known and had been in space for decades. And these engineers came in with the gall to say, well, we could replace those with CubeSats. Ha, ha, ha. It was Capella Space, for those of you who know about it, starting in our class. Capella Space, basically, if not obsoleted, certainly complements and led the whole synthetic aperture radar CubeSat thing, and which is just a fancy way to say it was a piece of disruptive technology that observed that all the expensive stuff that the DoD had been building with primes can now be both miniaturized, number one, but cost reduced by like a factor of 100 or 1,000. Which was not just better, but game changer. And now there are multiple SAR instances in space. Another one later on was Vannevar Labs. Nini and the rest of those of you who know Vannevar, that had just had a $90 million A round or something. And which was funny is because they're essentially an OSINT tool, but here I was in a building a month ago and about 3 groups stand up and said, and from our Vannevar Labs, and I went, what? And it turns out they're in more places than I think they either know or will admit. And so, I don't know, Joe, who else?
Those are great. I mean, we've had, I like the Agrippa story, how, contested logistics in Indo-Pacific, and they're off to the races now.
Oh, can we talk about the fish reel story? Do you remember this, the Navy SEAL diving CO2 thing? And do you want me to tell it? Or you want?
Yeah, well, tell it.
So this was a team of freshmen, and stop me, Joe, if I get this wrong, but it was a great example of how the class works. Yeah. We got a problem from the medical director of SEAL Team something that said, look, our divers are spending way too much time underwater and they have symptoms of carbon dioxide or poisoning or too much exposure. We just need a simple sensor, right? He thought he had a problem, give us a solution. And naively, we went, okay, sure. And the team formed around that problem. And they had a medical device person, and they had whatever, and they had, coaches in that domain. And so the first thing they do, whole methodology, the class, get out of the building, talk to the SEALs. Which, by the way, I didn't even know what a SEAL was. I think they were first going to go to the zoo. But instead, they found the SEALs, and they told them, hey, this is what the medical director wants, where would you like this little sensor? And what do you think their answer was? At the bottom of the ocean. Well, why? Well, they were smart. What would the medical director do if they saw they were taking too much carbon dioxide? What would they do? Pull them out. Well, you're SEAL. You don't want to be pulled out. But here is the magic of the class, because this is what we taught the team. They said, well, okay, you don't want the device, but why are you exposed to carbon dioxide more than, our missions are lasting much longer underwater than they're supposed to. Again, asking why. Well, why is that? Well, we get lost. What do you mean you get lost? You're in a SEAL delivery vehicle. How hard is this? You're pointing. Well, there's a lot of metal sometimes in places where we're going. Well, don't you have, GPS? Well, no, our buoy only goes so high. Well, now they had a much different problem definition, which wasn't CO2, it was time to mission, right? And two is, it was no, they didn't have an accurate navigation device in magnetically challenged areas. So they qualified as divers in the Stanford swimming pool, the entire team, and developed a CO2 deployable antenna that got deployed as a workaround for this SEALs team that they used in a couple missions. These were freshmen, right? Freshmen.
10 weeks.
10 weeks. So that was when we thought perhaps we're onto something in this class. Now, we weren't trying to replace a SEAL delivery vehicle, and there was supposed to be a new version and whatever, and gosh knows what happened, and people went, oh, you can't do that, or blah, blah, blah. But it was a great example of everybody thought it was pretty simple. It was just needed a CO2 meter. But the minute you got out and talked to the warfighter, well, that was just a symptom of, and by the way, when we went back to the medical director, he said, well, they never told me that. Well, he never asked them.
Yeah.
All right, sorry for the...
Yeah, no, I think you actually bring up, touch upon a good point, that we've talked about in this class, where the buyer is so far removed from the end user. And how do you think, as you're curating these problem statements, finding solutions, how do you find that balance between, are the problem statements coming mostly from the buyers and the students are then going out and talking to the end users, or how are you balancing all that?
I mean, it's a mix of sponsors. Oftentimes, our students will, we will start out working with a problem sponsor and realize the problem is someplace very differently and kind of leave the sponsor behind. That's not the problem. Here's the real problem. That's a symptom of a problem, perhaps. So Steve's methodology, that it does it. You find out oftentimes what you think is a problem is a symptom, and you do your discovery, you get out of the building, you talk to enough people, and you realize here's the real root of the problem. So,
and by the way, this is incredibly hard for all of you. The reason why it's not technically hard, there's no math involved, but to be honest, it's a lot easier to do if you're dumb, because you'll go assume you don't know the answer. The smarter you are, the more difficult it is to do this methodology. Seriously, right? Because by definition, you're at Stanford. You are some of the smartest people in the world. So how hard could this be to figure it out? The problem is, it's very rare that you can pre-compute the needs of potential customers and warfighters and stakeholders and understand the motives of saboteurs and requirements, et cetera, from sitting inside your room. Possible, but improbable. But again, it's a mindset thing. And so if you kind of do this, back off and say, and in fact, the way I usually approach very smart people is humor me. Let's assume you're right. Just go out and talk to 10 people. And if they agree with you, you get an A in the class, your team's done. I've yet to see someone win that bet, ever. And again, it's not that you can't pre-compute a lot of stuff, but these problems are, as Joe said, almost every time the problem is given, and we don't even know how it's going to end up, is always a symptom of something much more interesting. Some requirements writer somewhere else had it right 2 years ago, but the world has changed, right? No one would have pre-computed, Houthis shooting drones at us and us shooting SM-3s back in $20,000 drones. That just wasn't, there's no way someone could have figured that out. So that's why the methodology works. It just assumes that you're getting out and you're doing one of three things with an assumption, a guess. You're validating it. Hey, I was right, Steve, see? But most often, I'm invalidating that assumption. Or kind of half the time, I'm modifying the assumption. I got some new facts. It's kind of true, but maybe it's over here or somewhere else. Mm-hmm. I forgot what your question was.
Yeah, no. So you alluded to the fact that problem statements have shifted over the years as well. I assume given changes geopolitically as well. What have you seen over the years in terms of how those problem statements have changed? What are some recent problem statements that have emerged just given recent conflicts as well?
When we developed the class, had gone through over a decade of the war on terror, of the IED fight, of soldiers getting blown up, and so a lot of the problems reflected that experience. But we're shifting. Great power competition. High intensity. Major power war. But the approach hasn't changed. You're still using this methodology. The problems may change, but you go out and talk to people and you iterate. So the challenge that the Defense Department and the intelligence community are facing are shifting. You can't say the war on terror, the enemy gets a vote. We still have to, combat terrorism. But we are looking at peer competitors. Steve and I teach a class along with Eric Volmar, who's back there, another course instructor here, called Technology, Innovation, and Great Power Competition, where we're really looking at tech-informed solutions to some of the challenges of great power competition. But those challenges are shifting. But the only thing we've been perfectly effective at is not is not predicting the next war. So we think we may know the next war is. We're thinking Taiwan Strait, somewhere else, but we're probably dead wrong again. So we don't have the luxury of narrowing our lane of the problems we look at, but we definitely are expanding it from when we started the course to include a lot more of the traditional major power war and the problems associated with that.
So, Joe, you just reminded me about the shift from IED. I'd say if I had to pick the major shift, it's from IEDs to drones, right?
Yeah.
Right. But there is a great IED story. Do you remember there was a problem that was, how do we now train Iraqi IED folks from all the knowledge the U.S. IED folks had? And we had a team who was trying to understand, what does an IED explosive ordnance disposal team actually do? And they came in class 2. You have class 1. Do you remember this?
Yes.
Rah, 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 rah.
We should have a photo.
Class 2, blow-vating. That's usually my job. Yeah, blah, 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 blah. And finally I said, what the heck do you know about IED disposal? These are just PowerPoint slides. Have you put on an IED suit? This is to the team. No, where would we get that? Turns out there's an FBI training course in Oakland. Well, the next week, they get us videos of them, remember, walking downstairs, carrying the stuff fully decked out in IED. Oh, they had a much different appreciation of what...
They went from 0 to hero. The week before, they were the zeros.
Right. Well, there was another example, and again, this is just giving you an example, but experiential means in this class. Anybody know what BUDS is? BUDS training? What is it? Yeah, what is it? Kind of day at the beach, or what is it? What is it?
It's a lot of physical stuff. It's a lot of underwater testing.
Great, absolutely. It's not a day at the beach. It's pretty miserable. Probably some of the toughest, hazing ritual you could get in a class. And so one of the problem sets we had were from the BUDS instructors about, were our checklists okay and whatever. And of course we had educators on the team. Do you remember this one? And they're like, this is very easy. We'll just look at the educational content of the BUDS curriculum. What did I do to it?
They went down and went through BUDS for a day.
We put them through BUDS training.
Wait, what did you put through BUDS training?
The team.
The team.
The team?
There's a great photo of this team coming out of the water, soaking wet in khakis.
Covered in sand.
It's the one I use for recruiting. If you're not used to doing this.
Get out of the building.
And so they clearly had a handle on, I get it. This is what the instructors are trying to do. This is what the students are trying to do. There's no possible way, if you've never been in the DOD or any type of intense training, you would understand both the complexity from the instructor's point of view, not trying to kill the students, and the student's point of view, and the instructor's trying to go through a checklist about what was actually needed to go do this. Boy, when they came back, they personally had a pretty deep understanding. Again, it wasn't the whole course, but they got wet, right? Or the DMZ problem in Korea, team went to Korea. Okay, now they understood some of the problems in DMZ.
Yeah, I was with the commander on the border with North Korea and South Korea just this weekend, and he was remembering that team visiting him and just how much progress they helped him make.
And that was the interface between the Koreans and the U.S. teams. And again, yes, very easy to write a spec sitting in the building about, hey, here's how people should interact with each other, whatever. No, not to you.
Let's go to the North Korean border.
Wait a minute, we're not having lunch with each other, or or what are some of the problems that you just don't pick up until you actually.
So for the Korean visit, what was the problem statement, and what did they end up doing?
So I was actually in DOD at the time, so I got the secondhand version of it. Steve, you were in the class.
Well, I think a lot of this was this cross-cultural disconnect about handoffs and other things, and respect and different ways people kind of valued respect from one culture to another. 80% of the problem on this one was not the problem is given, but a cultural thing that you didn't understand until you're actually sitting there and go, we didn't really get well briefed on the cultural interactions. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What are some of the biggest challenges that student teams face when going through Hacking for Defense?
Well,
aside from InQTAL just not giving a clear problem statement.
I think you alluded to it already, Steve. This notion that you may be really brilliant and have gotten the right answer your entire life, never gotten an A- in your life, but all of a sudden you realize that you're repeating what Steve said, you're not as smart as the collective wisdom of all these beneficiaries and stakeholders that you can interview. So I think there's still a notion that I got it figured out. I know the answer. Let's go down the path versus letting this methodology work and really waiting a while, because there's a lag time. And all of our students have this experience where there's this kind of a downturn in morale because you just feel overwhelmed because you're just doing the discovery.
You just went through BUDS training.
Right.
Proud despair.
But it just doesn't make sense to you until you've just you hit that inflection point where, oh my gosh, now I start to see where the problem is, and I can my hypotheses are getting more and more focused, and I can iterate with a little more clarity and focus. So, but yeah, I think the students, the bottom line, I would say the biggest challenge is being a little overwhelmed by the complexity of the problem and the immensity of the discovery until they kind of start to narrow down and get some clarity. And also, if you're a shy person, you're not going to be shy for long if you're going to stay in the class. You got to get out there. And these are great people skills that you learn independent of solving. You get out, you understand how to interview people and get information from them and present. So it's a great, just the sheer communication skills you get out of the course is worth taking. But over to you, Steve.
No, I just want to, it's very funny you reminded me, like, these things are by design, not by accident. So when I did this version for the commercial world, the version for National Science Foundation is I was teaching equivalent to your professors, principal investigators who wanted to get their projects funded. But I decided after meeting them for a while, the difference between an introvert and an extrovert from them was whether they were looking at their shoes or your shoes. And the goal of the class was actually to teach them how to make eye contact after 10 weeks. And there wasn't a single principal investigator or their grad students who weren't able to do that, because we would force that process, not just go hand it off to someone else. So you mentioned that, but it really makes sense. Plus, there's a benefit, though, for those who take the class who have been in government service or are still in it. You get to use the Stanford brand to talk to people you would never, ever get access to inside the military. You call up 4 stars. I mean, our network and other people's network, sure. And by the way, the class has a good enough brand that people will, at minimum, respond via email or set up a VTC video conference call with you, et cetera. So that's another benefit. But third is, as Joe mentioned, by design. By design, this class emulates the chaos uncertainty of starting something with a series of unknowns. It's pretty easy when you're in a given organization and there's existing process and a known path for actually acquisition or something else. Boy, when you start with a series of unknowns, if you're not comfortable with chaos and uncertainty, at least on the battlefield, you're going to get shot. Or if in the business world, someone else will take your job, or you're going to get removed as CEO, because what matters is, you run to the fight and you figure it out as you go. This actually teaches that on purpose. That first couple of weeks of all this stuff is coming at you, and the problem isn't the problem, and the sponsor's telling you one thing, and Steve and Joe and Pete are saying, no, ignore the sponsor, and like, what the heck is going on? That's by design, because you will come out of that. When you come out of that, you're 100x more stronger because you're based on facts, not like someone told you to do X. The other downside about this class, not downside, but confusion at first, is wait a minute, the problem came from a sponsor. Do I work for that sponsor? And sometimes the sponsor thinks all you are hired free hands at Stanford to build a prototype for them or get them funding. And sometimes you got to fire the sponsor, if not them, at least their problem. And that's the teaching team's job.
Has that happened?
Oh, all the time. Is to say, the problem you gave the team has discovered X and Y, like they're going to move from here to here. Joe, you've seen that, right? Sometimes you have to get on that call, right? And go, sorry, they're going to head over here. Kind of fun. So every year, the presentations are amazing. I mean, I just look back to prep for tonight to some of the years we've done. And it turns out, we've moved from IEDs to drones, if I have to say the major thing, but we were still doing 5-6 years ago, GPS denied stuff. Somebody and sponsors had already figured out that like PNT, and other ways to navigate without GPS access was going to be a real problem. Drone swarms was a thing even 7 years ago, right? Even though it wasn't the main thing of the DoD, we were already having problem sets way ahead of the curve. We've had quantum stuff, we've had others, and stuff that comes out of the woodwork is really pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Can I tell the one Columbia University story? Sure. Have you heard this one, or no?
Until Ernestine cuts us off.
All right. So this class is taught in multiple universities, and this quarter, I think, have you heard this story about the problems? Somebody passed on to me, the Columbia professors have a problem, is they obviously are in New York City, and so is the MSS and GRU headquarters in the United States, right? China's state security and Russian armed forces intelligence. And so the class had turned into a honeypot for both those groups. I mean, there were Chinese students and Russian students. I'm sure some of them were accurate students, but just like here. And they said, well, what problems do we give these guys to work on? Because like at Stanford, Columbia, anybody who's signed up for the university could take the class. And I said, well, why don't we make up 2 special problems? And so we decided to create a how to penetrate the Chinese A2AD network and gave it to the Russian team. And how to defeat the Russian EW drone problem in Ukraine, and we gave it to the Chinese team. And I'm just waiting to see what they do when they report to headquarters. So sometimes we both embrace the problem and stand back and see the result. I can't wait, actually. I'd like to see the result.
Will be fascinating.
We should all see the presentation.
So maybe final question for me is just talk a little bit more about the process going, starting at Stanford and then going national and then now international. Like, what was that like?
I mean, this is just my attitude, Joe's and Pete, is why do something once? Like, what's the point, right? If you got something and you think it's going to be good, don't start and wait around. Declare victory and build it for scale. So the first time I built the Lean Launchpad class and did it for the NSF, I wrote an educator guide. I had a training course for training instructors. We trained the trainers. The NSF I-Corps classes in 100 universities, but the original educator guide and all the slides I wrote for that were designed to scale this thing. And I should tell you a story about how we figured out it could scale. So here we are. We're seeing the last presentations for the first National Science Foundation class, which was held here at Stanford. And the program managers for the NSF are over the moon. I mean, you can just see them as their teams are presenting. There were 25 teams in this first cohort. And they were just going, can't believe you got them to do this in 10 weeks. We've been trying to get them to do this for years, blah, blah, blah. We need this to scale. And I had gotten 2 venture capitalists I knew to teach with me. And one of the VCs heard that and said to me, Steve, there's no way this could scale. We're the world's best instructors. And okay, that's why he's a VC. I mean, I think I'm good, but I'm not that good. And I said, John, let's assume we are the world's best instructors. Would the class work if instructors were 90% good as us? Oh yeah, it would. John, how about 80%? Oh yeah, I guess it would. 70%. We kept going down until he stopped at 40%. I said, well, don't you think at 40% we could find a lot more instructors than us? And he said, well, I guess you're right. And so now there's 100 plus or maybe 150 instructors for I-Corps. There's probably 75 or more for hacking for defense, where if you give people a methodology, you give them an educator guide, you train the trainer, and you keep the complexity of what you want to teach relatively simple, and you do most of the learning by having the students learn, it becomes pretty easy to design things to scale. Not all classes could work like that, but so just as an aside, there's not only hacking for defense. The year we started hacking for defense here, we started hacking for diplomacy with Jeremy Weinstein, who's still a professor here. I think it's still being taught.
He's the dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard now.
He is?
Yeah.
Jeremy? Oh, okay. I guess he learned something in the class, huh?
Yeah.
So I think that's still being taught at, but unfortunately state didn't scale it, but defense scaled hacking for defense. There's hacking for oceans and climate here. There's hacking for education, which just started in the education school. So there are a number of variants because, again, the class is relatively simple framework. It's the problem sets and the domain experience of the instructors. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure you could teach hacking for defense if your teaching team didn't have some type of military or intelligence background. Mm-hmm. But if you have some entrepreneurial background and then adjuncts with that domain expertise, these things are pretty portable. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. And it all started with the lean startup methodology.
Well, lean startup just simply came from me being an entrepreneur for 21 years. And then, how many of you have done a startup or been involved in one, right? In a startup, if you're having big thoughts, I'm going to fire you. Your thoughts are focused on a narrow beam, maybe about your market, but certainly for survival of your company. It wasn't until I got to retire that I actually started to think about the nature of innovation and entrepreneurship and how we were being told to build startups, which were you're simply a smaller version of a large company. That was the implicit mantra in the 20th century to startups. Large companies write business plans, you write them. They write 5-year plans, you write them. They hire sales, marketing, and biz dev on day one. You do that too. And by the way, everybody executes via what's called waterfall methodology, alpha test, beta test, first customer ship, assume everything works. That was the methodology. There was no other language, no other tool set, no other thoughts. There wasn't even a way to describe anything different. And it was only because I had time to actually think about the nature of what we were doing and why it didn't actually match what the successful patterns of entrepreneurs were. I didn't invent anything. I simply removed, how they described how Michelangelo did a sculpture. He didn't do a sculpture, he just removed the stone around it. And what I did was simply removed all the noise around what best practices were already there and just gave it a language. Does that make sense?
Yeah. An incredible past several years doing that.
We really didn't look at this as a class, but we called it an insurgency. But basically, we wanted to create a movement. As Steve said, he was three of us that started this were all veterans of different wars, some of us the same wars. But they're saying if you build a field, they will come. We thought if we could create opportunities for our best and brightest to get involved, to use their incredible intellect and creativity and apply it towards problems that really matter, that they would come. And we've seen some speakers earlier in this course that, you can profit. Defense tech, there's national security, there's profit there, and great. And there are the Palantirs and the SpaceX and the Andurils, and that's great. That is driving a little bit of it. But we're tapping into this, what we consider this sense of patriotism, if you will. You don't have to be an American, but this sense of duty where you want to contribute, you want to serve, you want to make a difference. And it's hard to find that some days. And it's pretty onerous to ask someone to join the military, to join the 3-letter agencies in the intelligence community or other government agencies. But for people just like you to take a class called Silicon Valley and the U.S. government, we wanted to attract people just like you and give them the opportunity, the tools, the methodology, the problems, and the access to really go out there and make a difference and join this movement because the stakes are too high not to bring our best and brightest to the fight, if you will. So that was our inspiration, and we were just heartwarming to see it scale across the country and other countries because our vision for the future is shared, as far as the U.S., but there's another vision out there that's antithetical to that, and let's hope we win. And this is one way we help ensure that.